My name is Bruce Rutherford, and welcome to Common Sense for America. In 2009, I read Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. He argued that the 13 colonies should be independent from the English crown and should form their own separate country. But I was inspired to write my own pamphlet, which I called Common Sense for America. So what I hope to do in this series of podcasts is to discuss with you those various principles and how they could make our country better. Let's start with the Declaration of Independence of 1776. Now, Thomas Paine wrote and published his Common Sense pamphlet in January 1776. The Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, was convened later that year. And the Congress asked John Adams and Benjamin Franklin to form a committee to write a Declaration of Independence. Those two immediately went to Roger Sherman of Connecticut and Robert Livingston of New York and asked them to join the committee. Then Franklin and Adams went almost hat in hand to beg Thomas Jefferson to be a part of the committee. Jefferson was widely recognized as the most well-educated man in the Continental Congress. He was also known to be a very poor public speaker, but an extraordinary man of letters, a man who could put words on paper better than anyone else in the Continental Congress. Adams and Franklin wanted him to be the primary draft person for the Declaration of Independence. Now, they told him that everything that he drafted would be subject to review by the committee, which would in turn be subject to review by the Continental Congress. So Jefferson entered into this with some constraints and some trepidation, but he took the task upon himself, and ultimately he and the committee produced for the Continental Congress what I would say is the most famous political document ever produced, certainly the most important political document after the Constitution produced for the United States. A lot of people don't realize that when the Second Continental Congress endorsed the Declaration of Independence and published it, only about 1/3 of America wanted independence from the English crown. About 1/3 wanted to remain loyal to the English crown, and they were considered loyalists, whereas those who wanted independence were considered patriots. And about 1/3 of the population didn't care one way or the other. And so it was quite controversial. And understand that the movement for independence it was not throughout the 13 colonies. It started in Massachusetts, and specifically in Boston. It started with Samuel Adams, to a lesser extent his cousin John Adams. Adams and Hancock were considered by the British master smugglers. And before they were considered revolutionaries, they were considered organized crime members. But they were arguing for independence, and they made most of their living by smuggling. John Hancock never touched the goods himself, but he made a fortune in smuggling. And so the roots of the revolution were very, very localized in Boston and in Massachusetts, and certainly didn't spread beyond Philadelphia until long after Breed's Hill, which we call Bunker's Hill, long after the Battle of Breed's Hill. And it was shortly after that battle that the Declaration was published. I made a special pilgrimage to Boston to walk the Freedom Trail, to see where Hancock lived, to see where Paul Revere's silversmith shop was, to see the Red Dragon Inn where these guys would meet and conspire together. They were considered criminals by the British, but they considered themselves patriots in response to what they thought was taxation without representation, to the heavy hand of the English crown on them, where they thought the colonies had no voice whatsoever in their laws and in the enforcement of the laws. And they were right about that. It was very clearly right about that. And King George could have taken a lighter hand with the colonies and avoided the whole mess of the revolution, but he chose not to. He wanted money to pay for the 7 years French and Indian Wars. And he wanted the colonies to pay for it because the war was fought largely in the 13 colonies, in the northern 13 colonies and in Canada. And he wanted the colonies to pay for that war. He was deeply in debt, so he levied tax after tax, law after law, without consulting the colonies. And these men became smugglers to avoid those taxes, and the British considered them criminals. Now, today, our focus is on the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. The third paragraph is a long indictment of King George, which is no longer of any importance to us. The second paragraph outlines the reasons why the country declared its independence. Now, we all remember from our junior high school educations those famous words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The expanded phrase actually says, "Behold, it's self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." What follows are the words that governments are created amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and governments are created to secure these rights. I'm getting the words a little mixed up, but the idea is that our country and our government was created to secure the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the whole reason the United States exists, and the whole reason it should continue to exist and to function. And so life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness we can argue that those are the three most important common sense principles to guide all public policy and laws in the United States. Our very reason for existing as a nation is to protect your life, to enhance your individual freedom, and to empower you to pursue happiness however you choose to pursue it. And they crafted those words to be an all-encompassing phrase, something that would capture everything you could think of for the nation, for the objectives of the nation. Life is the sine qua non. What we say in Latin is without which there is nothing. Without life, liberty's kind of a meaningless word. If the government can protect us and keep us safe, now liberty is an important issue, a very, very important issue. Your individual liberty is the key thing that you must have if you are ever to achieve happiness. Without your individual liberty, you can't be happy. So you see, you go from life to liberty and then finally to happiness, which is undefined in the Declaration of Independence. I think they deliberately left it undefined so that you and I could determine happiness for ourselves in our own unique way. If they had defined happiness with certain limitations or tried to put it into a box, they would have left a lot of people out. They chose not to define it, but that leaves it to us to define happiness in our way. There are other rights that we should consider. How about the right of privacy? That's an interesting, very interesting issue to raise. Privacy, the word privacy doesn't appear anywhere in the Declaration of Independence, and it doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. Now, keep in mind, in 1776, there was no such thing as X and the internet, and we didn't even have, we didn't have telephones. People communicated by letter or by face-to-face. Privacy was hardly that big an issue in those days, and today it's certainly a larger issue. Should we consider privacy as one of those rights that should be guiding government? I would argue that yes, we can consider privacy as a right in light of the guiding principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We should test all of these issues against those three principles. Does this enhance our public safety and keep us safe? Does it enhance our individual liberty? And does it enhance our ability to pursue happiness in whatever way that we wish? In my opinion, we should look at all issues in light of these three measurements. Now, we may say abortion is a right that has to be considered. Very controversial today. How would we consider that in light of life, obviously? Liberty, we are talking about the liberty of a woman, whether or not she has the right to bear a child or not, or must bear a child. And finally, we're talking about the pursuit of happiness. I can't imagine an issue more directly involved in the pursuit of happiness than the issue of abortion. No matter which side you're on, happiness is a critical issue there. So these are principles, common sense principles by which we can evaluate and determine how we want to proceed with all issues of our government, laws and policies. The Declaration of Independence does not mention responsibilities. I believe the founders and the drafters of the Declaration of Independence thought of these responsibilities, but they thought they were so obvious that they need not be mentioned. Now, the most obvious one in 1776 was the responsibility to be self-reliant. Keep in mind, 1776, the nation is about 4 or 5 million strong. Almost everyone was an immigrant to the 13 colonies. No one crossed the Atlantic thinking that someone was going to help them in the crossing or help them when they got here. They were all undertaking this dangerous, arduous journey, adventure, without any expectation of any help. They were very, very self-reliant. And once they got here, they settled into the coastal cities and the relative safety. But soon, many of them went right into the wilderness to carve a farm out of the woods and the wilderness, to establish a trading post near a river ford or a crossing, to establish small villages where farmers could gather to trade their goods and gather for some protection. So this self-reliance, born of our immigrant background and heritage, is, in my opinion, a major factor in what makes America great. I think it's one of the character traits that gave us what we call the greatest generation, that lived through the Depression and won the Second World War. We try to teach our children to be self-reliant. We don't teach them to be reliant on government or reliant on Aunt Emma. We teach them to be independent and self-reliant. I was born into a wealthy family. My father was very prosperous. I was a silver spoon child, if you will. And in my early teenage years, my father lost everything. Lost his business. He lost the farm. He lost the house. He lost the cars. Lost everything. And then he was convicted and did 3 years in a federal penitentiary. That's quite a change in life. In the course of that, my brother became mentally ill, very, very seriously mentally ill. And I became afraid that I too was going to become mentally ill. So I was worried all my life that I was going to end up like my father, broke and dishonored, or mentally ill like my brother. I'm married. I had 2 children. And having had 2 children, I could really feel the weight of my responsibility to take care of my family. And I was desperately afraid that mental illness would eventually find me and that I couldn't take care of my family. I remember when my children were very young, my PTA organization coached my wife and I to make sure that our children were 98% independent when they graduated from high school and hopefully went off to college. And I took that challenge very, very seriously. And believe me, it could be very frustrating at times. But even now, we teach our children to be self-reliant. And we should have, as a government, policies that encourage and enhance self-reliance. Now, in the 1960s, in response to the terrible economic conditions that were held over from the Great Depression and that were a part of our terrible racist background and segregation, we installed various programs under the name of the War on Poverty. We installed programs called the Great Society and a million other programs designed to reduce income inequality and to improve the level of social well-being in the lower and middle income classes of the United States. A lot of these policies, although all were very well intended, a lot of these policies ate away at the issue of self-reliance. They were all trying to do good for people, and they ended up doing a lot of harm. They broke up a lot of families, removed fathers from the home, destroyed the father-child relationship, and made the children even more dependent on government. Lots of mistakes. So these kinds of programs, although well-intended, were very, very ill-conceived. And they're an example of how government did not do what it should do. It did not enhance and encourage self-reliance. It did the opposite. Not because it deliberately did so, it did so out of ignorance, and in some cases, out of being lazy. So this is the kind of thing that we should pay attention to. And I would argue that we now have 4 key common sense principles to guide the United States in its policies and its laws: life, liberty, happiness, and self-reliance. Think about these things not as a partisan political person, but as a patriot. Discuss them with others, debate them back and forth. And if you just think about these things, I don't ask that you agree with me, but if you think about these things, I think you will approach many of the issues that we face today in a different light with a different perspective. Now, thank you so much for being with me on the first issue, the first episode of Common Sense for America. In the next episode, we're going to address our immigration crisis at the southern border. Until then, God bless you and God bless America.